Discussion. Basal metabolic rate. Background. Basal metabolism represents the minimum energy required by a mammal to maintain endothermy and basic homeostasis. Lusk, 1917, page 141. Kleber, 1932, 1961, page 251. Benedict, 1938, pages 191 to 215. Brody, 1945, page 59. Robbins, 1983, pages 105 through 111. Mammals with lower than predicted basal metabolic rate maintain endothermy and enjoy its attendant advantages at a discount, whereas others, with rates that are higher than predicted, pay a premium. Calder, 1987. Such variation in basal metabolic rate appears to be tied to ecological circumstances rather than taxonomic affinities. Vogel, 1980, McNabb, 1986a, 1988a, 1989. And depending on environmental conditions, each rate provides an individual with various advantages and limitations. During the course of evolution, therefore, each species' basal metabolic rate evolves to provide it with the best match between its energy requirements for continuous endothermy, its food supply, and the thermal characteristics of its environment. Captive versus wild raccoons. Male raccoons trapped in summer had higher basal metabolic rates than our captive animals in any season, Table 2. The higher rate of metabolism of these trapped males could have been due to the stress of captivity or to the fact that wild animals actually may have higher metabolic rates than those that have adjusted to captivity. If the latter is true, then our data for captive animals underestimated the actual energy cost of maintenance metabolism for Procyon Lotor in the wild. At present, we have no way of determining which of these alternatives is true. Seasonal metabolism of raccoons. In some temperate zone animals, basal metabolic rate is elevated in winter, which presumably increases their cold hardiness. Conversely, lower summer metabolism is considered to be a mechanism that reduces the potential for heat stress. Such seasonal variation in basal metabolic rate has been found in several species. Collard peccary, Teyasu tajaku, Zervanos, 1975, Antelope jackrabbit, Lepus eleni, Hines, 1977, Desert cottontail, Sylvilagus auduboni, Hines, 1973, and perhaps cold acclimatized rat, Rattus norvegicus, Hart and Hero, 1963. Unlike these species, our captive raccoons showed no seasonal variation in basal metabolic rate, Table 2. Instead, raccoons achieved cold hardiness in winter and reduced their potential for heat stress in summer with a large seasonal change in thermal conductance, Table 3. Here is the first table that breaks everything. Comparison of Procyon Lotor with other procyon. Procyon Lotor has a much higher mass-specific basal metabolic rate than other procyon. To quantify the magnitude of this difference, we compared the measured value for Procyon Lotor with one calculated for it from a mass-specific least squares regression equation. Equation 6, r to the power of 2 equals 0.78, derived from data for those procyonids with lower than predicted basal metabolic rate. Potos flavus, Procyon cancrivorus, Nasua narica, and Basiliscus astutus, Table 7. Basal metabolic rate equals 2.39 times m to the power of negative 0.25, Equation 6. Basal metabolic rate in Equation 6 is basal metabolism, milliliters oxygen times g to the power of negative 1 times h to the power of negative 1, and m is body mass in grams. Measured values of basal metabolic rate for Procyon Lotor were 1.45 to 1.86 times greater than those predicted for it by equation 6. Table 8. Basal metabolism, milliliters oxygen times g to the negative power of 1 times h to the negative power of 1 of Procyon Lotor as predicted by equation 6. Basal metabolism equals 2.39 times m to the power of negative 0.25. Body masses used to calculate predicted values and measured values were taken from Table 7. Another table we're not reading! Influence of diet on basal metabolism. Background. With respect to basal metabolic rate, McNabb, 1986a, page 1, maintains that the influence of climate is confounded with the influence of food habits, and that departures from the Kleber 1961 norm are best correlated with diet. Although this does appear to be the case for diet specialists, the analysis is not so clear-cut for omnivorous species, McNabb, 1986a. His analysis also indicates that an animal's behavior, i.e. whether it is terrestrial, arboreal, subterranean, aquatic, etc., secondarily modifies the influence of food habits on basal metabolic rate. For example, terrestrial frugivores have basal metabolic rates that are very near predicted values, whereas arboreal frugivores have rates that are much lower than predicted. McNabb, 1986a. Table 9. Food habits of some procyonids. References for foods were as follows: Potos flavus, Procyon cancrevoris, and Nasua nasua taken from Bisbal, 1986. Nasua narica taken from Kaufman, 1962, pages 182 through 198. Basiriscus astutus taken from Martin et al., 1951, Taylor, 1954, Wood, 1954, Towell and Tier, 1977, and Trapp, 1978. Procyon Lotor, taken from Hamilton, 1936, Stewart, 1943, pages 218 through 220, Staines, 1956, pages 39 through 51, and Greenwood, 1981. Symbols represent either qualitative, pound sign, or quantitative, plus and cross, assessments of feeding habits. Pound indicates that the animal was observed eating the food. Plus and cross represent volume and frequency, respectively, of food utilization. No attempt was made to account for seasonal variation in the use of these foods. Food habits of procyonids. Food habits of 6 procyonids for which metabolic data are available are presented in Table 9. All 6 species clearly have mixed diets. Compared to other species, Procyon Lotor is highly Catholic in its diet, taking food from almost twice as many categories as Nasua narica, 3 times as many as Procyon cancrevoris, Nasua nasua, and Basiriscus astutus, and 9 times as many as Potos flavus. For those species for which food habit data are quantified, we used Eisenberg's 1981, pages 247 through 251, substrate feeding matrix method, where substrate is analogous to McNabb's 1986a behavior, to construct the following feeding categories that are based on the major food groups utilized by each species. Table 9. List. 1. Potos flavus. 1. Arboreal frugivore, insectivore. 2. Procyon cancrevoris. 1. Semi-aquatic crustacivore, molluscivore, insectivore, piscivore, carnivore. 3. Nasua nasua. 1. Terrestrial insectivore, arachnidivore, carnivore, frugivore. 4. Basiriscus astutus. 1. Terrestrial carnivore, insectivore, frugivore. 5. Procyon Lotor. 1. Terrestrial carnivore, granivore, frugivore, insectivore, and 2. Semi-aquatic crustacivore, molluscivore, insectivore, piscivore, carnivore. Food habits and basal metabolism. The most important foods in the diet of Procyon lotor are vertebrates, nuts, seeds, and fruits, Table 9. These are the same foods that are eaten by those dietary specialists that have basal metabolic rates equivalent to or higher than values predicted for them by the Kleber equation, McNabb, 1986a. The most important foods in the diets of Potus flavus, Procyon cancrivorus, and Nasua nasua are invertebrates and fruit, Table 9. And these foods are eaten by dietary specialists that have lower than predicted basal metabolic rates. McNabb, 1986a. Major foods in the diet of Basiriscus astutus are terrestrial vertebrates, insects, and fruit. Table 9. Dietary specialists that eat terrestrial vertebrates have higher than predicted basal metabolic rates, whereas those that feed on insects have basal metabolic rates that are lower than predicted. McNabb, 1986a. Year-round utilization of vertebrates by Basiriscus astutus suggests that it also should have a metabolic rate that is equivalent to or higher than predicted, rather than lower, McNabb, 1986a. However, perhaps year-round inclusion of insects in its diet, Martin et al., 1951, Taylor, 1954, Wood, 1954, Towell and Tier, 1977, Trapp, 1978, plus water and energy-conserving advantages of a low metabolic rate, each exert a stronger selective influence on basal metabolic rate than do vertebrates in its diet. Summary. The basal metabolic rate of these prosonids does appear to be influenced by diet, but it is apparent from this family's evolutionary history and tropical origins that climate also has had a profound influence on its members' metabolism. The history of the family and the data presented here, Table 7, suggests that lower than predicted basal metabolic rates is a feature that evolved very early as the primary metabolic adjustment to a tropical climate. From this perspective, it could be argued that climate would have been the major selective force determining basal metabolic rate, whereas food habits would have had a secondary influence. Basal metabolism and intrinsic rate of natural increase. Background. McNabb, 1980a, suggested that if food is not restricted during an animal's reproductive period, the factor that will limit growth and reproduction will be the rate at which energy can be used in growth and development. Under these conditions, an increase in basal metabolic rate would actually increase intrinsic rate of natural increase, because it would provide a higher rate of biosynthesis, a faster growth rate, and a shorter generation time. Heinemann, 1983, tested McNabb's 1980a premise and found a significant correlation between intrinsic rate of natural increase and metabolic rate, independent of body size, for 44 mammal species. A low correlation coefficient for this relationship, however, indicated to him, Heinemann, 1983, that factors such as 1. Food supply, 2. Thermal characteristics of the environment, and 3. Brain size also contribute toward shaping a species' reproductive potential, particularly when these factors strongly influence rates of biosynthesis or growth, or for some reason alter generation time. Results of our estimates of intrinsic rate of natural increase for procyonids are presented in Table 10. Procyon lotor. This species had the highest basal metabolic rate and diversity of diet, and also had the highest intrinsic rate of natural increase. 1.34, Table 10. Such a high intrinsic rate of natural increase may infer that this trait evolved under conditions where food and temperature were not limiting to reproduction. Under these conditions, selection could have favored those reproductive characteristics sensitive to a higher basal metabolic rate, biosynthesis, growth, and generation time. McNabb, 1980a. Procyon lotor's high reproductive potential is due to its early age of first female reproduction and its large litter size, characteristics that may reflect metabolically driven increases in both biosynthesis and growth. Basiriscus astutus. This species has a low basal metabolic rate, but an intrinsic rate of natural increase that was 124% of expected, Table 10. This suggests that intrinsic rate of natural increase evolved under conditions where food and temperature were not limiting to reproduction. Reduced litter size should restrict this species' reproductive potential and may be a reflection of its low basal metabolic rate. The factor that is responsible for increasing its reproductive potential, however, is its early age of first female reproduction. Basiriscus astutus is the smallest of these procyonids, and even though it has a low basal metabolic rate, its small mass may contribute to its ability to reach adult size and sexual maturity in its first year. The high quality of its diet, a high proportion of small vertebrates, Table 9, also may be a factor that is permissive to early female reproduction. Thus, small body size and diet may be factors that have allowed the species to evolve to a higher than expected reproductive potential in spite of its low basal metabolic rate. Nasua narica. This species is one of the largest procyonids, Table 7, and it possesses characteristics that should limit its reproductive potential. Lower than predicted basal metabolic rate, Table 7, a relatively low-quality diet, Kaufman, 1962, pages 182 through 198, Table 9, and delayed time of first reproduction, Table 10. In spite of this, Nasua narica has a higher than expected intrinsic rate of natural increase, 111% of predicted, Table 10. The life history feature that enhances Nasua narica's reproductive potential and increases intrinsic rate of natural increase beyond expected is its large litter size. In this species, females live in bands. Each year, just before their young are born, these bands break up, and each female seeks out a den for herself and her litter. Once the young are able to leave the den, approximately 5 weeks, bands reform. In this situation, females not only care for their own young, but also for those of other females in the band. Kaufman, 1962, pages 157 through 159, 1982, 1987, Russell, 1983. This social structure may contribute to this species' ability to produce large litters and in this way increase its reproductive potential. Table 10. Intrinsic rate of natural increase, Rmax, of several procyonids. A equals potential age of females producing first young, B equals potential annual birth rate of female young, equals average litter size divided by 2. Average litter size was calculated from the published range of litter sizes for each species. N equals potential age of females producing their final young. R max E equals intrinsic rate of natural increase expected from body mass, Heinemann, 1983. R max R equals ratio calculated to expected intrinsic rate of natural increase, R max divided by R max E. So another giant table that breaks everything, with footnotes we're not reading because it wouldn't make sense without the table. Nasua. Unfortunately, there is not enough reproductive data to allow calculation of intrinsic rate of natural increase for Nasua, Table 10. Therefore, it is not possible to compare the reproductive potential of this South American coati with its North American relative, Nasua narica. Given its low basal metabolic rate and relatively low-quality diet of fruit and terrestrial invertebrates, Table 9, however, intrinsic rate of natural increase for Nasua may be very similar to that of Nasua narica. Procyon cancrivorus. The age of first female reproduction for Procyon cancrivorus has not been reported. However, if one assumes females can reproduce in their first year, intrinsic rate of natural increase for Procyon cancrivorus would be 1.02, 132% of expected, Table 10. If, on the other hand, first female reproduction is delayed until the second year, intrinsic rate of natural increase would be 0.65, 84% of predicted, Table 10. Procyon cancrivorous has a low basal metabolic rate, reduced litter size, and small body mass. Its low basal metabolic rate may limit litter size, but as with Basiliscus astutus, the quality of its diet, a high percentage of small vertebrates, Table 9, and its small body size may make it possible for females to reproduce in their first year and thus increase the species' reproductive potential. This reasoning would argue that Procyon cancrivorous probably enjoys higher rather than lower than expected intrinsic rate of natural increase. Potos flavus. In addition to a low basal metabolic rate, this species possesses other characteristics that limit its reproductive potential. Low-quality diet, delayed reproduction, and birth of a single young each year. Because there does not appear to be any other feature of its life history that can counteract the influence of these factors, intrinsic rate of natural increase in Potos flavus has evolved to be only 48% of expected. Point 30. Table 10. Its close relative, the Olingo, Basiliscion gabi, appears to share the same condition. Table 10. Summary. This brief survey illustrates that, with the exception of Potos flavus, proconids tend to have values of intrinsic rate of natural increase that are higher than those predicted for them on the basis of mass. Table 10. Regression analysis indicates that within the family, body mass accounts for only a small amount, 3%, of the variation in intrinsic rate of natural increase, whereas the positive slope of the correlation between ratio of calculated to expected intrinsic rate of natural increase and basal metabolism R equals 0.93 suggests that low metabolism has a limiting effect on intrinsic rate of natural increase. See Table 10 footnote B. The implication here is that low basal metabolic rate would be associated with a lower rate of biosynthesis, a slower growth rate, and a longer generation time. Proconids with low basal metabolic rate but higher than expected intrinsic rate of natural increase must possess other traits that serve to offset the effects of low metabolism. Our survey indicates that the following features compensate for low basal metabolic rate and help increase intrinsic rate of natural increase. 1. A high-quality diet may make biosynthesis and growth more efficient, thus optimizing the time element associated with each of these processes. 2. Larger litter sizes and cooperation in care of the young may increase survivorship in spite of a slower growth rate. And 3. An early age of first reproduction, a long reproductive lifespan, and moderate-sized litters, 2 to 4 young, may in the long run add as many individuals to the population as a shortened generation time. Our survey also suggests that, at the other extreme, factors such as a low-quality diet, reduced litter size, absence of cooperative care of the young, delayed age of first reproduction, and shortened reproductive life span all serve to decrease intrinsic rate of natural increase. Thus, it is obvious that diet, litter size, social structure, reproductive strategy, and reproductive lifespan can operate synergistically with basal metabolic rate to magnify its influence on intrinsic rate of natural increase, as with Procyon, Lotor, and Potos flavus, or they can function in opposition to basal metabolic rate to change the direction of its influence on intrinsic rate of natural increase, as with Basiliscus astutus, Procyon cancrivorous, Nasua narica, and perhaps Nasua nasua. Basal metabolism and climatic distribution. Procyon Lotor. The evolution of a higher basal metabolic rate, tables 7 and 8, may have been the physiological cornerstone that enabled Procyon Lotor to break out of the mold being exploited by other procyonids and to generalize its use of habitats and climates. Once this basic physiological change was in place, selection for appropriate alterations in thermal conductance, capacity for evaporative cooling, diversity of diet, and energy storage would have provided this species with the suite of adaptations needed to extend its distribution into other habitats and climates. Support for this concept follows from the fact that high levels of basal metabolic rate are associated with 1. Cold hardiness in mammals that live in cold temperate and Arctic climates, Scholander et al., 1950c, Irving et al., 1955, Irving, 1972, pages 115, 116, Shield, 1972, Vogel, 1980, Golightly and Omart, 1983. 2. The ability to utilize a wide variety of food resources and to occupy a large number of different environments and habitats. McNabb, 1980a. And 3. A high intrinsic rate of natural increase. McNabb, 1980a. Heinemann, 1983. Littlegraven et al., 1987. Nicol and Thompson, 1987. Thompson, 1987. Other procyonids. Other procyonids, Potus flavus, Procyon cancrevorus, Nasua nordica, and Nasua nasua, have lower than predicted basal metabolic rates, Table 7. A characteristic that is considered to be an energy-saving adaptation for those that live in a relatively stable, tropical and subtropical habitats. Müller and Kulzer, 1977. Chevalier-Hugo et al., 1980. Müller and Rost, 1983. However, Basariscus astutus is found in tropical, subtropical, and temperate climates. This species is found from tropical Mexico to temperate regions of the western United States. Kaufman, 1982, 1987. Nowak and Paradiso, 1983, page 979. In the northern part of its distribution, Basariscus astutus lives in habitats that are unstable, arid regions, that are low in productivity, and that characteristically have marked seasonal changes in temperature. Its lower than predicted basal metabolic rate could be an important water conserving adaptation at times when temperatures are high. McNabb and Morrison, 1963, McNabb, 1966, Macmillan and Lee, 1970, Knoll and Van Holzer, 1979, and an important energy-conserving mechanism when cold weather may limit food availability and hunting time. Scholander et al., 1950c, Wang et al., 1973. As will be seen later, Basariscus astutus is unique among procyonids with lower than predicted basal metabolic rates in that it also has a lower than predicted minimum wet thermal conductance. Table 7. This allows it to use less energy than expected for thermoregulation at low temperatures. Another species with a similar set of adaptations, lower than predicted basal metabolic rate and minimum wet thermal conductance, is the Arctic hare, Lepus arcticus, Wang et al., 1973, which lives in one of the coldest and least productive regions on Earth. Wang et al., 1973, suggests that this combination of adaptations allows Lepus arcticus to better match its energy requirements to the low productivity of its environment. A similar relationship may hold for Basariscus astutus, particularly in colder, arid portions of its distribution, and may be the reason that it, but not other procyonids with low basal metabolic rates, has been able to inhabit temperate climates. Minimum thermal conductance. Background. Thermal conductance is a measure of the ease with which heat is passively transferred to or from a body through its tissues and pelt. Within the thermoneutral zone, a mammal is able to vary its thermal conductance over a wide range of values by changing heat transfer characteristics of both of these layers. Minimum thermal conductance occurs when total heat transfer through these layers is reduced to its lowest possible rate. This minimum value, which is the reciprocal of maximum resistance, occurs theoretically, but not always practically, at the animal's lower critical temperature, and is best estimated under standard conditions in a metabolism chamber. McNabb, 1980b, Ashoff, 1981. Minimum thermal conductance scales to body mass. McNabb and Morrison, 1963. Herod and Kessel, 1967. McNabb, 1970, 1979b. Bradley and Devers, 1980. Ashoff, 1981. Therefore, to make comparisons between species of various sizes, we scaled out body mass by expressing minimum wet thermal conductance as the ratio of measured to predicted values. CMWR, Table 7. These ratios were used to make comparisons of heat transfer characteristics between species that occupied different habitats or climates. Effect of molt on thermal conductance. In summer, lower critical temperatures of male and female Procyon Lotor, figure 2, were very similar to those of other procyonids, 22 degrees Celsius to 26 degrees Celsius, Table 7. In winter, lower critical temperature of both sexes shifted downward to 11 degrees Celsius, figure 3. This seasonal shift in lower critical temperature occurred as the result of a seasonal change in minimal thermal conductance, Table 3. For many northern mammals, a seasonal change in thermal conductance is partly mediated via cyclic changes in the insulative quality of their pelt. Scholander et al. 1958, Irving et al. 1955, Hart 1956, 1957, Irving 1972, page 165. Procyon Lotor begins to shed its heavy winter coat about the time its young are born. Molt progresses through summer, and by late August the new coat is complete. Stewart, 1942. During its summer molt, Procyon Lotor's minimum wet thermal conductance increased by about 49% over the value for female raccoons in winter. Table 3. In summer, therefore, it had the highest mass-specific minimum wet thermal conductance of those procyonids considered. Ratio of measured to predicted values equals 1.77 and 1.79, Table 7. An increase in thermal conductance facilitates passive heat loss for temperate and Arctic species, and this serves as an important thermoregulatory adaptation during warm summer months. Scholander et al. 1950C, Irving et al. 1955, Hart 1956, 1957, Irving 1972, page 165. This adaptation is particularly important to those temperate and Arctic zone species, including raccoons, whose basal metabolic rates do not decrease during summer. Irving et al. 1955. From August on, the fur of Procyon Lotor becomes increasingly longer and heavier, with peak or prime condition occurring in late fall and early winter. Stewart, 1942. Minimum conductance of our captive raccoons was lowest in winter. Ratio of measured to predicted values equals 1.15 when their pelts were in prime condition, tables 3 and 7. Because primeness of raccoon pelts varies geographically, thicker pelts being associated with colder climates, Goldman, 1950, page 21, Whitney and Underwood, 1952, pages 24 through 41, the degree of seasonal change in minimum wet thermal conductance must also vary geographically. The only other procyonid for which a seasonal molt has been described is Bassaricus astutus. Molt in this species extends from late summer to late fall. Towell and Towell, 1978. How molt affects thermal conductance in Bassaricus astutus is not known because metabolic data for this species, Table 7, apparently were collected only when their pelts were in prime condition. Chevalier, 1985. Goldman, 1950, page 20, reports that Procyon cancrivorus does not have a seasonal molt. Like other tropical procyonids, Procyon cancrivorus lives in an environment that has the following characteristics: high, even temperatures throughout the year, 1 degree Celsius to 13 degrees Celsius difference in monthly mean temperature. A greater range in temperature between day and night than in mean monthly temperature throughout the year, uniform lengths of day and night, seasonal variation in rainfall, and lowest temperatures during the rainy seasons. Kende, 1961, page 340. In such a stable environment, there would be no advantage to a sharply defined seasonal mold cycle that could place an animal in thermoregulatory jeopardy by increasing its thermal conductance. This would be particularly true for animals like tropical procyonids that have lower than predicted basal metabolic rates, but that maintain typical eutherian body temperatures. Consequently, molt in all tropical procyonids may either be prolonged or continuous. This is a feature of their biology that needs to be examined in more detail. Comparison of thermal conductances. Procyon Lotor versus tropical procyonids. Ratio of measured to predicted values for Procyon Lotor in winter was 1.15, which is similar to the values for Potus flavus and Procyon cancrivorus, 1.02 and 1.25 respectively, Table 7. These two tropical species, therefore, have minimum wet thermal conductances that are similar on a mass-specific basis to the value for Procyon Lotor in winter. However, at their lower critical temperatures, the thermal gradient sustained by these tropical animals is only about 11 degrees Celsius, whereas for Procyon Lotor in winter it was 26.5 degrees Celsius. Examination of equation 4 with respect to these thermal gradients suggests that tropical procyonids achieve such low minimum wet thermal conductances by virtue of their lower than predicted basal metabolic rates, rather than by having pelts that are exceptionally good insulators. In fact, the insulation afforded by the pelts of these tropical procyonids is about the same as that of the 50-gram Arctic lemming. Dicrostonyx groenlandicus rubicatus, whose coat has an insulative value that is about half that of the hare, Lepus americanus, red fox, Vulpes fulva alacensis, and pine marten, Martis americana, animals comparable in size to these procyonids. Scholander et al., 1950a. Therefore, pelts of these tropical procyonids do not have the same insulative value as the prime winter coat of Procyon Lotor. Nasua narica and Nasua nasua have tropical and subtropical distributions, and they are the only procyonids that are diurnal. Kaufman, 1962, pages 103 through 105, 1982, 1987. Because they are active during the day, they experience a more extreme thermal environment, higher air temperatures and solar radiation than their nocturnal cousins. Values of ratio of measured to predictive values for Nasua narica, 1.45 and 1.55, and Nasua nasua, 1.24 and 1.65, are higher than those for Procyon cancrivorus or Potus flavus, Table 7. Thus, these coatis have higher mass-specific minimum wet thermal conductances than their nocturnal tropical cousins. A high minimum wet thermal conductance reduces the cost of thermal regulation in hot environments because it increases an animal's ability to lose excess heat passively. The higher minimum wet thermal conductances of these coatis serve as an adaptation that contributes to the success of their diurnal lifestyle, as well as their ability to expand their habitat use to areas with less thermal stability, such as oak and pine woodlands and deserts. Basiriscus astutus. This species has the lowest mass-specific minimum wet thermal conductance of these procyonids. Ratio of measured to predicted values equals 0.85, Table 7, which indicates that its pelt has a greater insulative value than the coats of Potus flavus, Procyon cancrivorus, Nasua nasua, or Nasua narica, This, coupled with a lower than predicted basal metabolic rate, allows Basiliscus astutus to maintain body temperature with less energy expenditure than is possible for any other procyanid of comparable size. And this combination of adaptations provides Basiliscus astutus with a distinct energy advantage in environments that have low productivity. Wang et al., 1973. The evolution of a pelt that provides better insulation must be considered an important contributing factor for the spread of the species into desert regions of the western United States. Thermal regulation and use of stored fat at low temperatures. Background. Thermal regulation. At temperatures below a mammal's thermoneutral zone, heat loss exceeds basal metabolic rate. To maintain body temperature under these conditions, metabolic rate must be increased. Equation 4. Procyon Lotor in summer during its annual molt, Table 5, Figure 2. Basiliscus astutus, Chevalier, 1985. Naswa, Chevalier, Hugo, et al., 1980. Mugas et al. In preparation. Naswa Narika, Scholander et al., 1950b. Mugas et al. In preparation, and Potus flavus, Müller and Kulzer, 1977, Müller and Rost, 1983, all are able to elevate their metabolic rates by 130% above basal when they are exposed to air temperature of 0 degrees Celsius. Procyon cancrivorous responds to 0 degrees Celsius with an increase in metabolic rate of 257% above basal. Scholander et al., 1950b. All animals listed have about the same lower critical temperature and body temperature, so the temperature differential producing this response is about the same for each species. Metabolic ability to defend body temperature against low ambient temperatures, therefore, is well developed in these procyonids. Such large increases in metabolic rate are energetically expensive, and if these animals were routinely exposed to air temperature of 0 degrees Celsius, it would be difficult for them to acquire enough food each day to maintain endothermy. Raccoons in winter pelage, however, need only elevate their metabolic rate by 47% above basal to maintain endothermy at air temperature of 0 degrees Celsius. Table 5, Figure 3. Each year at the completion of its molt, the raccoon's highly insulative pelt is renewed. This lowers their lower critical temperature by 9 degrees Celsius to 15 degrees Celsius below that measured for them in summer, Figure 3, and decreases their cost of thermoregulation at low temperatures. The increased insulative capacity of their pelt is one of the primary adaptations that has allowed Procyon Lotor to extend its distribution into cold climates. Stored fat. Cyclic fattening is an integral and important part of a raccoon's annual cycle. Mugas and Seidensticker, manuscript. However, it has not been reported for other procyonids. During winter in parts of the United States and Canada, raccoons are confined to their dens for variable periods of time, days to months, depending on the severity of the weather. Stewart, 1943, pages 223 through 225. Whitney and Underwood, 1952, pages 108 through 116. Sharp and Sharp, 1956. Meck et al., 1968. Schneider et al., 1971. During this confinement, they do not hibernate, but rather enter a state of dormancy and become inactive. While dormant, they remain endothermic, body temperature greater than 35 degrees Celsius. Thorkelson, 1972, pages 87 through 90, and derive most of their energy requirement from fat reserves accumulated during fall. The rate at which fat stores are consumed during winter dormancy depends on the thermoregulatory requirement imposed on them by local weather conditions, the insulative quality of their pelt, and any advantage they may gain by seeking shelter in a den. Thermal model of the raccoon and its den. Heat transfer between an animal and its environment is a function of the interaction of its body temperature and thermal conductance with various environmental variables: air temperature, wind speed, vapor pressure, and thermal radiation. When a raccoon is outside its den, its thermal conductance, CMW, is the only barrier to heat transfer with the external environment. However, when it enters a tree den, a raccoon imposes two other thermal barriers between itself and the external environment. 1. Conductance of the airspace between its fur and the den's walls, CA. And 2. Conductance of the den's walls, CD. Thorkelson, 1972, pages 59 through 63. Thorkelson and Maxwell, 1974. Thorkelson and Maxwell, 1974, modeled that heat transfer of a simulated raccoon, a water-filled aluminum cylinder equipped with a heater and covered with a raccoon pelt, in a closed tree den. In their system, 65% of attributable to the pelt, whereas the remainder, 35%, was due to airspace and conductance of the airspace and conductance of the den's walls. Because resistance is the inverse of conductance and resistances for the raccoon and its den are arranged in series, we can estimate total conductance, CT, of this system with equation 7. Equation 7. 1 over total conductance equals 1 over minimum wet thermal conductance plus 1 over conductance of airspace plus 1 over conductance of den walls. Minimum thermal conductance for raccoons in winter was 0.0172 milliliters oxygen times G to the power of -1 times H to the power of -1 times degrees Celsius to the power of -1, table 3. Based on Thorkelson and Maxwell's 1974 model, we let 1 over minimum thermal conductance equal 0.65 times 1 over total conductance equals 1 over 0.0172 milliliters oxygen times grams times G to the power of -1 times H to the power of -1 times degrees Celsius to the power of -1, and 1 over air conductance plus 1 over conductance of den walls equals 0.35 times 1 over total conductance. Substituting these values into equation 7 and solving for total conductance yields 0.0112 milliliters oxygen times G to the power of -1 times H to the power of -1 times degrees Celsius to the power of -1, a value that is 35% lower than that of the animal alone. Substituting this value and the value for basal metabolism of winter raccoons, 0.47 milliliters oxygen times G to the power of -1 times H to the power of -1, table 7, into equation 4, and solving for body temperature minus air temperature yields a new temperature differential of 42 degrees Celsius. Therefore, by using tree dens, raccoons in north-central Virginia with body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, figure 7, could effectively reduce their lower critical temperature from 11 degrees Celsius to -5 degrees Celsius and markedly reduce their metabolic cost of thermoregulation. Metabolic advantage of the den. Given prevailing winter temperatures in north-central Virginia, see Materials and Methods, Adult raccoons in that area should be able to sustain endothermy most of the time they are in their dens by simply maintaining basal metabolic rate. Depending on the mass of their stored fat, they could remain in their dens for several weeks without eating. Mugus and Seidensticker, manuscript. The thermal advantage of a den could be further enhanced during colder temperatures if 2 or more raccoons occupied it at the same time and huddled together, and or if these animals could reduce minimum wet thermal conductance even more by lowering body temperature and cooling their extremities. Although we do not have any data to verify the second mechanism, there are many accounts in natural history literature that document raccoons occupying dens together. Lotz and Anderson, 1979. This habit could be particularly important for the young of the year, and may be one reason why they often continue to den with their mothers during winter. Lotz and Anderson, 1979. Seidensticker et al., 1988. Raccoons that live in colder climates, such as Minnesota, undoubtedly obtain the same advantage from a den as Virginia animals, but because of their greater body mass, longer fur, and potentially lower minimum wet thermal conductance, lower critical temperature of a Minnesota raccoon in a den could be even lower than what we calculated for Virginia raccoons. Therefore, when they are in their dens, raccoons living in very cold climates also may be able to maintain homeothermy with a basal level of metabolism.